Good morning and welcome to Beyond the Binary. This is Benny here. Aaryn, unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately. Fortunately, in some ways, is in San Francisco having the time of her life while meeting with all kinds of activists and artists, and she herself doing all kinds of art. So she'll have things to report when she comes back. I pick her up this Thursday, so definitely she will be back with us next week. Anyhow, here I am. Beyond the Binary on 91.1 FM, WDBX Community Radio for Southern Illinois. You can catch us online at facebook.com/Beyond the Binary. I'm going to be addressing a few topics today, but primarily I will be addressing what occurred on campus last night when Chi Alpha, an RSO, invited Linda Seiler to come speak, and the counter-protest that took root as a result of her presence on campus. So before I get going on there, however, I'm going to stick to our routine even in Ari's absence and start us off with a song. And this song is by Heidi Barton Stink called Direct Action Do-Over, and I will be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to Beyond the Binary here at 91.1 FM, WDBX Community Radio for Southern Illinois. This is Benny, and again, Ari is not with us this week. She is in San Francisco listening from a distance, although there it would be 7 a.m., so I'm going to say it's a safe bet that she's probably still asleep. Nonetheless, hello, everyone. I'm going to open up today's show with two important stories, one of which is something that I've been closely following for some time, and at this point, regular listeners should already be very well versed in California legislation AB 1266, also called the School Success and Opportunity Act. AB 1266 is the act that simply says that California schools are required to respect the gender identity of all students and to allow students equal access to all school activities and facilities based on one's gender identity, or when one is expected to identify their gender identity, whatever that may or may not be. So AB 1266 was passed and went into effect on January 1st of this year, and the National Organization for Marriage, which was the large financial think tank organization that raised lots of money to overturn propose Proposition 8, essentially, funneled all of their money into this let's overturn AB 1266. So the millions upon millions that they raised in trying to overturn marriage equality in California then got funneled into this let's respond to AB 1266. This, of course, is also in conjunction with the work of Frank Schubert. And Frank Schubert was the architect of marriage discrimination ballot initiatives all across the country. So if you've never heard the name Frank Schubert, he's someone to constantly keep an eye, ear, your perception, your spidey senses, everything in tune with. They are not necessarily an ally, if you will. But anyhow, proponents of anti-trans discrimination, like the National Organization of Marriage and Frank Schubert, gathered a total of 619,387 signatures. Now, these signatures were to request putting a repeal vote on the ballot. And in order to do so, at least in in California, you needed at least 504,760 votes to be valid in order to qualify. So again, 619,000 was what they had. What they need was 504. So clearly there was this kind of concern that they in fact went overboard, or they successfully found it. However, they in the end ended up missing the mark by more than 17,000 signatures, because when a full check of the signatures went out, it turns out of the 619,000 signatures, only 487,000 were actually valid. So that was a lot of numbers I threw at you just now. I understand. I'm with you on that. So I'm just going to try to break this down a little bit. They forwarded over 600,000 signatures. Just under 500,000 of those actually counted, and they need 504,000. If the proponents, National Organization of Marriage and Frank Schubert, challenge the count in court, as they say that they're going to do, they have to somehow win back about 13% of the rejected signatures. As it stands right now today, victory in terms of AB 1266 not being challenged, at least on the upcoming ballot for this year. that's a huge win in the state of California, and it's something that I'm continuing to follow, something that I think is very important, particularly as other states are starting to enact similar legislation. Now, the other bit of news that I want to share with you all, this was reported in The Advocate, and this was a story that's been developing since the beginning of the year. Robina Asti is a 92-year-old transgender widow and World War II veteran, has come away victorious in her recent battle with the Social Security Administration. Her husband, I can't find his name all of a sudden, but anyhow, her husband passed away and was denied the claim of survivor benefits because essentially what was said was Asti was, quote, legally male, end quote, at the time of her marriage, rendering the widow ineligible to receive benefits usually granted to Americans when a spouse dies. Lambda Legal took on Asti's case, making the argument that Asti was legally female at the time of her marriage, as was supported by various pieces of government identification. Therefore, Lambda argued that Asti was owed the same benefits she would have received had she been a cisgender or a non-trans woman married to a cisgender man. Ultimately, in the end, this long battle ended up winning in Asti's favor, and she is now receiving Social Security benefits, which also begs the question, what is the Social Security Administration now going to do as they move forward in terms of policy to ensure that trans folks are in fact recognized for such reasons? So, yay for Asti. Congratulations. All right. So those two stories being said, I now want to move into an event that took place on campus at SIU, and we did post this on Facebook, and it may have seemed last minute, but that's because all of the organizing efforts were in fact last minute. But anyhow, Chi Alpha is an organization on campus. Here's the background part. Chi Alpha had invited Linda Seiler to come speak on campus, and Linda Seiler works at Purdue University in Indiana, and her job is working with the Chi Alpha chapter that's there. And Linda Seiler, in her own testimony, claims that she thought she was a man for some time, so claims the transgender identity in some capacity. From what I know, she hadn't lived as man. I'm not entirely sure, though, and I'm not saying that to legitimize or to delegitimize her claim, but to say that this is part of her background, that she thought of herself as a man for some time who was attracted to women. And ultimately, she saw that as being a form of brokenness. And I'm going to get into what brokenness means in a moment here. But ultimately, through prayer, through her relationship with her God, she was made non-transgender and heterosexual. She experienced, quote, authentic desire. So there's that background, okay? So this kind of proponent for change, that a person can change their gender identity through willful prayer, what have you. Okay, so a number of us had issue with this. I have my own background in research as well as personal experience in conversion therapy spaces, and I'm going to go out and call this what it is. It's a conversion therapy logic. We did report a while back that Exodus International recently closed its doors, and Exodus was the largest financier and I guess proponent of conversion therapy, really trying to evangelize the world by influencing and encouraging queer people to become not queer, whether that's cisgender or heterosexual. The leader of Exodus International and his wife came out and said that they apologize for all the harm that they have done, and they officially closed the doors to Exodus International. So having Linda Seiler here speaking along these lines shows us two things. One, that the impact of Exodus International continues to persist. Just because Exodus has closed its doors does not mean that this logic has disappeared. Second, it means that we need to be extra cognizant about the new rhetorical ways and tactics that this type of logic kind of props its little head. So I admittedly saw the poster around campus at SIU, and it was somewhat looking like a rainbow. And it had said the title of her talk, and the title of the talk was Sexual Orientation, What's the Big Deal? Uh-oh, here comes my morning yawns. Oh, I always do that. Excuse me. Sexual Orientation, What's the Big Deal? Compromise, Compassion Without Compromise was the name of her talk. And so on one end, we have this notion of a person who has dealt with gender identity issues, if you will, and then now she's been asked to come speak about sexual orientation. So I kind of want to begin the dialogue there, how incredibly troubling it is that we have a speaker who comes to give this, quote, Christian response to homosexuality, even though she's talking primarily as an individual who was working through gender identity. If she understood gender identity the way that gender identity functions, then she would know that if she saw herself as a man attracted to women, that would make her a straight man. So in some ways, we could say that she did not deal with homosexuality, she dealt with gender identity issues, but nonetheless is speaking or was speaking on the topic of sexual orientation. This is very dangerous terrain to traverse when these two, sexual orientation and gender identity, get conflated as one and the same, because they are certainly not one and the same, but they certainly like to dance together. They certainly like to be friends together. But to say that we are speaking about both of these things as if they are one and the same is deeply problematic, troubling, and it really minimizes the deep difference between these two and how different bodies navigate these two very different scripts in some way. I'm going to go with the word script there. This how one reacts, how one embodies, how one is doing their sexual orientation and or gender identity, or in some ways, and also sex, I guess, identities as well. So anyhow, Linda Seiler comes to campus and speaks yesterday, and a shout out to Melissa and Stacy, who kind of felt some dis-ease and really wanted to do something, respond to this. And so they started kind of these organizing efforts and back and forth messages, trying to talk about, what could be done or what not. And so into the fold came a number of other folks, Hannah, myself, Matt, wonderful people that I met over the course of the last week or so as our own relative networks kind of expanded and overlapped with one another. And ultimately what it led to was a response that we called Love, Not Misinformation. And our response, Love, Not Misinformation, was intended as an alternative, an affirming alternative that had the goal of debunking the pseudoscience that Linda Seiler was drawing on to make her claims. We were offering a space where local affirming religious organizations, religious bodies could be present and to express that there is affirming bodies here doing this liberal leaning and progressive work from within relative religious positionalities. And so various religious leaders came to speak last night at our event. And so I would say that in the end, our event was quite a success. There were what we called these three stations of sorts, where we had our activists lined up. One contingency sat through Linda Seiler's speaker, and we encouraged only people that were not triggered by this sort of rhetoric to sit through that speech and to offer critical questions about the type of research that she was drawing on, particularly outdated research. I'm talking 30-plus-year-old research that has been since refuted, that has been challenged, that has been changed. Research that is no longer supported by any research organization like the American Sociological Association, the American Psychiatric, Psychological, and Medical, all of these, none of these groups of scholarly bodies support the research that she is drawing on to make claims that queer people are broken in some capacity. So those folks were encouraged to sit through Linda Seiler's speech. The second group was outside and outside of Linda Seiler's speech, and they kind of their primary task was to make a presence that there were people who refused to go inside, but that this mattered enough to be present to show that we are present, but we are not going inside, while also handing out information handouts that corrected and offered correctives to the information about her, Linda Seiler being her, PDF presentation that we were able to access on the internet. As soon as word got out that we were responding, different things started happening on Linda Seiler's website. For instance, her PDF PowerPoint presentation was removed. Videos of her speeches on YouTube were removed. So clearly there is a response to the work that we were doing here in a way that we thought was important, and we persisted. So anyhow, that was the second station. Be present and then offer correctives. There was nothing violent invested in this. Our job was not to censor nor to stop Linda Seiler. Our task was to say, yes, do what you need to do, but also there's this alternative. In the midst of all this, fellow organizer Stacy and I were approached by university police and were escorted, if you will, inside to talk to Pastor Bruce, I believe his name is, and he's an individual working with Chi Alpha, and he was all smiles, of course, very, doing that whole we're very compassionate thing, and had a talk with us about, how their whole job tonight was to apologize to the queer community. Interestingly, they did not invite any members of the queer community to their event, and I really hope that Pastor Bruce and others are listening. We invited them to listen to this show. We invited them to our event. But anyhow, we were invited inside, and he said that their job is to apologize because we've messed up. We being, I guess, Christians. I guess they're speaking for all Christians, or at least they thought that. But they invited no queer community members to be involved in this dialogue. What they brought was Linda Seiler, who we might call an ex-gay, we might call an ex-trans person, who is there speaking and apologizing while using research that shores up support for homophobic and transphobic claims from a religious perspective. That if I were in fact Christian, I would be offended. I would be offended that she would be saying these things in the name of what I might perceive as one's God. So there's that, right? We go inside. Stacey and I are talking to Pastor Bruce. And then we also say, that there are affirming churches in Carbondale. There are affirming churches. We have the Church of the Good Shepherd, right? We have Christ's Disciples. We have Unitarian Universalists. Why were none of these religious bodies, why were none of the religious leaders of these relative organizations invited to speak at your event? Why did you bring Linda Seiler here? To which he had no response. To which Pastor Bruce looked at us and said, I didn't know. He did not know that these religious bodies existed in Carbondale. Which goes to show particularly where the level of ignorance resides in his experience. Now, that's not fully for us to fix, right? To what degree are you going to try to meet us? Well, it seems like not at all. It seems like there's going to be no budging. In fact, none of the leaders of Chi Alpha showed up to our event after Linda Seiler was done speaking. Not one of them. And the invitation was open. The invitation was open. So those were the first two stations. The third station was, in fact, our counter event, which took place in the Student Center at the Old Main Room with much support from the Student Center staff. We had last-minute organizing beginning on Thursday evening into Sunday morning. And what we did was we set up a podium and some rainbow pennants, these flags around the room. And we had speakers. We had all kinds of speakers that changed and challenged the discourse that Linda Seiler was preaching. We had affirmative messages. We had people that were talking about their own relative exodus from out of various religious organizations. And sometimes those exodus out of those spaces was not by one's choice, but by the demand of a relative religious entity. It was sad, it was happy, it was all kinds of things. But what it was above all else was healing for a lot of people. One of our really good friends, colleagues, allies, community members, Sarah, got up and had said that she does not see queerness and religious identity as being mutually exclusive, nor as being necessarily intertwined with one another. but it's both of these things. It's an amalgamation of both. And I found that to be a particularly poignant point, that, we don't want to say that they have to talk to each other, but that they also do sometimes talk to each other, this sexual and gender identity as well as religion. And so the primary point that we were trying to drive home last night with our organizing efforts was to provide a space where religious bodies could be present to say Linda Seiler is not the end-all and last word. There are organizations in this area, around the U.S. and globally, that work for, on behalf of, alongside queer bodies. And sometimes those queer bodies are in the leadership positions in these religious organizations. Now I want to turn real quickly, before I take a quick break here at the half-hour mark, and read a passage from Tanya Aaryn. Now, Tanya Aaryn is this comes from her dissertation, but this book that she published is called Straight to Jesus, Sexual and Christian Conversions in the Ex-Gay Movement. I guess I could throw my own work out there. My master thesis project was an ethnography, much the same, more autoethnographic. And of course, if you don't understand what that is, it's something that is described in my own thesis, and I'd love to have that dialogue with you anywhere. But ultimately, my piece is called Queering Conversion, an Ethnographic Account of the Ex-Gay Movement. So I do similar things that Tanya Aaryn accomplishes in her book, but I do want to read this here because it's very telling for some of the rhetorical tactics that take place here. And so this comes from her book, again, Straight to Jesus, pages 174, 175. And she offers a testament of Diane, a pseudonym. Diane has a testimony illustrating her rejection, or the role her rejection from the church and the military played in leading her to an ex-gay program. So I'm just going to read here a little bit. As the testimonies demonstrate, nothing is too private or painful to share, and it is those with the most unsettling tales who become the most sought-after speakers. Yet, just as the idea of recovery directs people to focus exclusively on the self to a certain extent, ex-gays lay claim to, quote, brokenness as a primary source of identity. The testimonial narrative of pain marks a person's entrance into the community of new hope and signifies his or her new ex-gay identity in Jesus. But in some cases, ex-gays can only speak of themselves within this language of pain and brokenness. Doug, another pseudonym, says he has become weary of everyone in the program proclaiming their trauma. Quote, "We all have brokenness, but if you keep on using that as a crutch, then you're never going to move on." I think that's one of the big problems we have here. We get into this brokenness contest. I'm like, let's move on, people, end quote. In the program, the emphasis on group sharing often leads to what Dwight called group hysteria. During many of the group meetings, one or two people would begin crying, and then suddenly everyone would be weeping. Although the men at New Hope felt that their confessions were fundamental to their healing, their focus on confession also fostered a sense of myopia. Many of them were too caught up in their own healing to envision their problems in a wider context or even to offer support to others. By focusing on individual stories of pain, the testimonies place the blame on individuals' choice rather than on the aspects of society that make it difficult to live as gay men or women. By making Jesus the only person who can transform a person, this process also removed any sense of agency from the individual, negating his potential power to transform the structures around him. I read that passage because it speaks to specifically to the predictability of Linda Seiler. When I saw that she was speaking and how she was speaking, and when I got to her PowerPoint, and I'm going to share some slides from her PowerPoint after the break, I saw that she fell into the usual, typical, predictable trap of precisely what Tanya Aaryn points out, and that's that this individual pursuit of change makes the common believer who is, quote, compassionate towards homosexuality believe that it's the individual's problem. They can't help it. They're doing the best that they can. It's an addiction after all. this is what Linda was talking about. So with that said, and with that in your minds, I'm going to go ahead and take a brief break. When I come back, we are going to finish up the show going through her PowerPoint presentation and me just kind of talking about what was said, and some potential responses at times to some of the stuff that is said. So we'll be back on Beyond the Binary, 91.1 FM, also online, facebook.com/Beyond the Binary. I'm going to play for you Against Me's True Trans Soul Rebel and FDB's Femme Fascist. We'll be back. Welcome back to Beyond the Binary with Benny and Ari. Unfortunately, Ari is not here. She is in San Francisco enjoying herself. I am in Carbondale enjoying myself, don't get me wrong. Anyhow, today we are talking about Chi Alpha bringing Linda Seiler to speak at SIU last night, and the community response to that presence. Excuse me, I'm doing my thing. Always yawning in the mornings. I'm not even tired. Oy. Anyhow, I kind of want to start off this segment, the second segment here, before I get into the PDFs, the presentation, or parts of the presentation at least, and note that we invited various media outlets last night, and to my knowledge and to the knowledge of the other organizers, not one of those media outlets showed up last night, suggesting a number of things, primary of which that this is not considered newsworthy information, that to convince local media to show up to an event that brings out literally hundreds of people is not media worthy enough. For a small rural community, I don't know what is considered media enough. I really don't. So I want to put that out there, and any other media folks from various spaces, not just WDBX, where I, for instance, have access to talk about these things, but I'm talking about WSIL, I'm talking about, is it KSFV, I believe it's called, various spaces that can help us out to get this type of word out, to make this the issue bigger than it is, because it is in fact bigger than it is. It was a shame. It was a shame not having media presence last night to really document at a grander scale that this was going on. And that's not to minimize WDBX, because certainly we are documenting it here and it is important. But that being said, I want to move into the presentation that Linda has online. This compassion without compromise, a Christian response to homosexuality. Now, one thing that she does is she likens this I like boys versus girls to chocolate cupcakes versus vanilla cupcakes. An analogy that is quite offensive to the core, because last time I checked, people who liked vanilla versus chocolate cupcakes were not persecuted against. I want to start there. And I want to stop there on that discussion, because it's that bad of an analogy. Now, one of the things that she ends up doing, and this is from those who sat through Linda Seiler's speech, was she, as well as Pastor Bruce, spent an inordinate amount of time at the beginning apologizing for everything that they have done to the queer community. I even got a hug. I mean, I feel better. I don't know about everyone else, but I was like, oh, good, finally. I feel better now about this. But what they end up doing is a very common tactic, and they turn to Reverend Phelps of Westboro Baptist Church. That would be the God Hates Fags guy. In fact, you can find them on godhatesfags.com. That's the name of their website. And they end up using Phelps as the example of what a bad homophobic Christian is. So that they can say, that's not us. We're different. Phelps becomes the individual that homophobes and transphobes can point to and say, but we're not them. And that's the biggest disservice. Because it means we then have audience members nodding heads saying, yeah, we're not Phelps. We're not the Phelps family. We're not Westboro Baptist Church. No, you're not. No, you're not. But what you are is still homophobic and transphobic. And it gets revealed through the message that you give to us. And it's something that we can see through the smiles and the hugs. Because you still refuse to listen and hear us. You refuse to invite us to your table. You refuse to allow us to speak as queer affirming and queer people at your events. It's not an actual apology. It's more painful. It's more difficult. Linda Seiler goes into a number of various typical scriptures from Leviticus, Judges, all the Old Testament stuff, which Father Brown last night was very useful, I guess, in some ways, or very helpful, it's a better word, at pointing out that the Old Testament is about stopping the oppression and do not be an oppressor. One of the biggest things that those like Phelps and Seiler and Chi Alpha tend to forego. The presentation gets into this point that a bad fruit is not a bad fruit by itself, but the bad fruit is the result of a bad root. Or, I'm sorry, but yes, a bad fruit is the result of a bad root. Making a joke about that from the 90s classic film, But I'm a Cheerleader. What is your root? What made you this way? So this next slide says, very typical tactics here. What causes same-sex attraction? It says bad fruit, bad root. Temptation is not a sin. So to desire bodies of the same sex and or gender is not a sin. To act on it is the sin. That sexuality and sexual identity is not a sexual issue, but in fact an emotional issue, she would have us believe. That it's a form of emotional confusion. And that same-sex attraction results apparently from living in a, quote, fallen world because of, quote, brokenness. And what does that? Well, an overbearing same-sex parent or an over-loving same-sex parent, the classic end-all molestation, suggestion from other people, so for instance, maybe meeting a gay person as a child will somehow make you gay. And maybe it can. I mean, in all possibility, I mean, when you see it, then you think, oh, I'm not a bad person. I can, in fact, live that way, too. To some degree, yes, our presence in the world does, in fact, make more queers because we show you it is okay. But our presence does not, in and of itself, create, manifest gender identity confusion, nor the attraction to someone of the same and or different sex and or gender. Seiler also says that bullying can be a potential reason why someone becomes queer. That's just offensive. It's just offensive. That somehow bullying leads to queerness, as opposed to maybe the bullies are bullying someone because they are already queer, or because they are perceived to be queer. And ultimately, Linda Seiler says that all of this can, quote, feel like you're born that way. Now, unlike a lot of people within some more or less mainstream queer spaces, I do not always fully support, if you will, no holds barred, the born that way logic. I just don't fall for it. I feel that when we hear a rhetorical tactic like, no, it's a choice, okay, we need to take that head on as it is. Fine. What if it is a choice? Now what? Is it still any of your concern? No. Born this way or choice, the reality is I'm living my life as a queer person. The only issue with queerness is your response to it. It's not me. I'm not the problem. You're the one struggling with it. So these two things take root here, this born this way thing, choice. And instead of running away from choice rhetoric, I think it is something that is advantageous for us to all consider, okay, and so what? Ultimately, finding your own freedom from this brokenness, this emotional issue, allegedly, is to convict yourself, to recognize that this is not a sexual issue, but that the sexual issue is temptation, but really what you need to struggle with is this emotional problem, that you're apparently hurt in your relationships, and that you need to be healed in your relationships. And that you need to let go of the fact, apparently, that you're not forgiven for being queer. And this is where, allegedly, Linda Seiler would have us believe that transformation begins to take place. Now from there, Seiler turns to all this pseudo-scientific work, Simon LeVay, hypothalamus study, who doesn't find a gay gene. We have Dean Hamer, who doesn't find a gay gene. And suggests that it's not to do with this born thing. So this is part of this rhetoric. If we do not know how to combat and go at this from not this physiological born this way rhetoric, if we do not know how to take it on at this choice level, then constantly they will win to some degree. If we do not know how to make a stand and say it doesn't matter whether or not it was environmental and or biological, or just a matter of I want to be with this person now, and I never recognized this before, but maybe I do, then, quote, they, end quote, will continue to win. We need to learn how to embrace this variation, that there are, in fact, queer individuals who have chosen to live as queer people. And that's also okay. And that's also okay. Here are some interesting statistics that are given out here. 52% of identical twins of homosexual men were homosexual. 22% of fraternal twins were likewise homosexual. 9% of genetically related non-twin brothers are homosexual. Not published. Don't even know where that comes from. But we have this 1991, everything is early 90s research coming out of this particular slide that I have here. Now, from those who were inside, the actual speech itself had said that some of this had changed, but not completely. Most of it was still the same. What was taken out was their talk about children, because they recognize it looks like that you can't talk like this. You can't mention these things. And apparently the response about why she had changed her slides was, here it is. I'm just going to put it out there. She said that the one that I'm looking at, the one I'm talking to you with, that she had online on her website, lindaseiler.com, was a presentation exclusively for an all-Christian audience. So apparently when she's talking to a mixed audience of Christians and queer Christians, which, by the way, at that logic, it also assumes one cannot be queer and Christian at the same time, that because there was a potential that queers would be present, she took all of the kids' research out. So what I'm about to say to you all here was information she took out because she didn't want to offend the queers. But apparently at her next venue, where maybe it's an all, quote, Christian audience, she might put it back in without any issue whatsoever because there's no pushback. Which is why it's important to show up and push back. I'm going to get into some of this rhetoric now about the kids and parents. And for those of you who are parents, this could be triggering. This comes out of research that is completely unfounded. This comes out of research that has not been supported by any organization that does research, particularly at a research institution like Southern Illinois University Carbondale. But nonetheless, it was put out there as research, as fact. In fact, this stuff here comes from faithfacts.org. Faithfacts.org. The overwhelming body of social science research agrees that children do best when raised in homes with married, opposite-sex parents. We don't know what that research is. It's just a quote that's put there. Now there's this one. Children of gay parents are most apt to be on welfare. Let's tackle this one at a time. Maybe. Is that a problem? Maybe with the stigma around social class issues. Maybe those kids are on welfare with their family because maybe there's workplace discrimination. Maybe this is an economic issue that needs to be taken more seriously. Apparently, children of gay parents are more apt to get a sexually transmitted infection. They have recently thought of suicide. They report being raped. They test impulsive. They smoke. They get arrested. Have pled guilty to a crime. Score high on depression. Be promiscuous. Be unemployed. Live socially isolated from others. Where does this come from? The Family Research Institute. A religious think tank that supports and funds research that is not only inherently biased itself, but completely unsupported by any actual research institution. Why do these things look this way for kids of queer parents? Maybe it's not because the parents are queer, but because the system dislikes queer people. And maybe the focus shouldn't be on the kids, but should be on the system that is driving different types of queer people and potentially the kids of queer people to act in self-destructive ways. Or maybe there's nothing wrong with smoking. Maybe there's nothing wrong with being promiscuous. Maybe there's nothing wrong with living socially isolated. Maybe we need to rhetorically rewrite some of these things that have been also framed as, quote, bad. And this is a really fun one here. Justification why same-sex marriage doesn't work. Because after all, we already discriminate based on marriage. I mean, you can't marry your mother, your father, or your sibling. You can't marry a minor or an animal. And you can't have multiple wives and husbands. So it's okay. This is, I can't even get to the core of how offensive this work is. And I want to return for one more moment to what fellow organizer Stacy and I had said to Pastor Bruce, and that was that so long as you bring speakers like Linda Seiler here and smile about it, you are missing the bigger point. That what Seiler does is passes around poison. She harms people. And if this is your excuse and example of an apology, I cannot accept it. It cannot be accepted. And that's just me, because it turns out you cannot apologize to one person and pretend as though that is the queer community, and that somehow that erases the thousands upon thousands of years of oppression against queer bodies. In the end, those who are listening who went to this event, I hope that you are able to think outside of Linda Seiler. She offers poison. She does more harm than good. And the apology that she offers is not wanted nor accepted. Not to this queer anyhow. Not to this queer. For those who were present last night and who were triggered by Linda Seiler and Chi Alpha at SIU, I do hope that you find solace and calm. I hope that you find someone that you can reach out to and hug and love and be loved in return. We must continue to fight. This is not outmoded thought. This is the stuff that is going on today in 2014. This is the rhetoric that is used to justify legislation and to justify the continued persecution of queer and trans people across all queer spectrums. Do not accept these apologies. You push further. The apology is not a way out. Any Chi Alpha members listening today, what is your next step? Because that certainly wasn't it. You did more harm than good last night. With that said, I'm going to leave you all with the song by Dallas Malice called Dan Savage. You all have a wonderful week. I'll be back with Aaryn next week. Catch us online, facebook.com/Beyond the Binary. You have listened to Beyond the Binary on 91.1 FM, WDBX Community Radio for Southern Illinois. Take care.